we are going to be hearing from Boryana Nenova, who is an expert on localization, optimization, and processes, and a project manager with truly extensive knowledge of machine translation and of the industry as a whole. And personally, I'm really happy and excited that she has agreed to be speaking at this webinar and to share her knowledge with us. And I'm hoping that we're all, including myself, are going to learn a lot of new and exciting things about machine translation. I am Michal Shitrit. I am a localizer and a UX writer and a localization consultant. I teach UX writing for localizers, and I write about localization and user experience at localizationstation.com, which is also basically the host of this webinar. So if you want to get more content or information, or basically hear about events about UX writing and localization and UX and localization, then you can go to localizationstation.com and basically see everything that we've published and subscribe to get updates. So we've decided to create this webinar because everybody are currently talking about AI and machine translation, right? Everywhere you go, every conference that you're participating in, every meetup, every webinar, every hallway conversation, people are talking about machine translation, and they're talking about AI, and they're talking about LLMs and content generation and all of those things. But nobody's really talking about using machine translation for UX specifically. A lot of people are talking about machine translation for different kinds of content domains, but nobody's talking about UX or about adapting machine translation for the needs of the UX industry. And it's understandable why that is, because using machine translation is hard on its own, and using machine translation for user experiences is even harder. And we're going to cover a little bit about the challenges today. So if you are already using machine translation, or if you're considering adding machine translation to your workflow, your processes, then hopefully you are going to gain some useful knowledge today. So we're going to start by learning basically what machine translation is, a little bit about the history of it, and how we got to the machine translation we are using today. We're going to learn about the advantages and the disadvantages of using machine translation in general. So why are so many companies basically jumping on the MT bandwagon today, but also why are some companies avoiding this topic? And we're going to talk about machine translation in the UX context, so why it's really hard to do and how we can still best utilize machine translation for our needs in UX. Then we'll get practical with workflows to incorporate machine translation for UX specifically and incorporate it in the UX localization process. And then we'll have time for questions too. So if you have any questions, keep them till the end, and we would love to hear them and answer them. And that's it. I'm going to pass the baton to Boryana, who's going to get started. So Boryana, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Michal, for having me. I avoid using the word expert, but indeed, I've been many years in the language industry. Happy to see a few familiar faces and colleagues who worked on projects. I wanted to say also that if you have any questions or like to connect, just drop a link in the chat. So interrupt us anytime. There's the raise hand feature as well, I think. So most of you, let's begin with a short history. Most of you have seen from NIMSI Insights. They generously shared this detailed representation of machine translation history during the last century. But there are a few key points, and we can summarize in rule-based machine translation, which was the first one. Then we moved on to statistical, which was predominant for the early 2000s. Then we all know about neuro machine translation and how everything changed and how suddenly Google Translate became much better at its job at zero-shot translations. And of course, since the end of 2022 and today, we're all talking about AI and how it affects the language industries. It's basically its language models. So let's have a very quick view how these four methodologies differ. While in rule-based machine translation, we have predefined sets. Basically, it's a list of grammatical rules and the dictionary with the first, second, third meanings. Then it's trained on words and phrases like idioms and expressions. But the truth is that this type of machine translation, the rule-based one, works best for languages with similar structures, let's say French and Italian or Spanish and English, etc. Then we moved on to the machine translation attempts moved to statistical, and they actually utilize bilingual corpuses or corpora And they actually used statistical data and n-gram measuring second, third, fourth to get the best, the most expected outcome. But again, based on the corpuses that were trained on, the most likely output. To move on to the next slide, we're going to neuro-machine translation and GPT. What did neural networks bring? Now, texts are processed on big data. We have neural clusters where their semantic roles play a significant role. There are vector embeddings which connect the words to their meanings. So it's a much more complex combination of both rule-based and statistical with additional semantic layers. And of course, there's also the technology Google introduced, and it's a different type of the general neural machine translations. It had extra layers of focus, in other terms, fine-tuning, and of course, the pivoting, which made it possible to translate texts without referring to pre-trained data. If there was no data, it could still translate. But it would pivot to other languages where data was available. And of course, GPT, it's neural again. The structure and the infrastructure is very similar. We have, again, the vector embeddings. However, they're not created, large language models were not created for translation. This is a byproduct. Translation is a byproduct of large language models. It's not their intent. It never was. It's something that it can do along with many other tasks. It pretty much works like neural machine translation. It can be connected and plugged over APIs. It has to be trained. It has to be, adapted to your text and sort and needs. But from research, recent research, it appears that it's less consistent and less focused than the neural machine translation, mostly because it's a byproduct. It's not its main purpose. To go back to the first one, what actually changed in the beginning with the rule-based, there was a lot of manual input. People were working on words, dictionaries, grammatical structures. Then with statistical, things moved on to phrases and deeper analysis. Of course, neuro is related to big data and a lot of a large amount of corpora, which are processed based on n-grams and very complex statistical models, and then semantic clusters. And the big change now is, of course, context and even larger amounts of data, the whole of internet. The approach, as we discussed, it's in the beginning, it was the word, now it's literally the whole language. So context, let's have a look at a recent research and how it compared actually the difference between ChatGPT and NeurMT models. It says that it's the source is XenoGPT MT report. It's based on a Microsoft study. And the result was that GPT 3.5 is still worse than other MT models. Again, we're talking about 0 or one-shot translations. On the other hand, on shorter phrases with less amount of context, GPT does better, exactly because it's processing large amounts of language corpuses, not just specifically trained data or smaller sets. It actually does better with shorter phrases and sentences, something which Michal will dwell upon later, because MT is intended for larger structures like sentences and not so much phrases. However, GPT 3.5 demonstrates rare and degenerate behavior. You will see a lot of hallucinations. You will see a lot of repeated words. And these things do occur in MT as well and in neural machine translation engines, but a lot less. It's still very unpredictable and uncontrollable to some extent. GPT models did better with trick examples, such as idioms, ambiguous expressions, or pronouns. Exactly because of the neural structures and the larger sets of data, GPT processes literally the whole language and utilizes a number of source of sources which can be colloquial, like consider using Reddit as a source where the flow of the language is a lot more natural than some article, for example. And what is the value deal? The value deal is the 5-shot translation. If you're curious, I will share the link of the source. They dwell upon how 5-shot dwell a lot on the topic how 5-shot example 5-shot setup, actually improves significantly. And also there's a reason to go for 5. First of all, it's cheaper. And based on Google research from March, 5-shot task is when you give the LLM a 5-shot task, and shots could be context, could be example of how to behave, and any other relevant information to perform the task. With 5 shots, we can achieve the average human potential. I don't know if you see this image large enough, but there are 2 main dotted lines at the 5 and at the 9. The 5 says human average and 9 says human best. So basically, even with the 5-shot setup, you will not get the human best, just to be clear, but it's cheaper, more easy to set up. And let's move on to something more fun. What happens with context? Of course, to me, that's meme time. And this is a very popular picture from the source is data. How do we process data without context? As you can see in this image, it has captured very different situations: dog sitting, dog standing, dog lying down. Basically, this is what translators used to receive without any context. So the result would be matching to the quality of the inputs. And let's do a quick UX context stress test. These are actual examples. And imagine you have these 3 buttons or blocks of text: save, left, and free. Just think about it. What is save? And what is your first association? What is left? What does left mean? You have 0 context. This is how linguists have worked so far for many years. This is how the machine also thinks. In rule-based, we would go to the first meaning, but in reality, we need context to actually make sense out of these single words, which are usually the most difficult. So we have 2 examples, 2 different variations here. If we have save as, and this context could be a separate button which says delete or discard changes, etc., we will translate save in one way. While if it's a save up to, or there's a percentage of a discount in many languages, the 2 meanings of these, the translation of these variations differ by a lot. One is where you save something as in store, and the other one is save as, as discount, put aside. And then if we go back, we had the word left. And then in this slide, we have go left or 3 of 5 left. I had a recent example of this. I was using one of my favorite apps, and it said 3 of 5 go left. Obviously, the translation was not done with context in mind. So this is a very nice example of the challenges that UX shows, because texts are short. You have to guess or use extra clues to make sense of it. The same applies for free, whether it's a free seat, one that is available, or free of charge ticket or something else. The idea here is that every n-gram counts, and just as much as humans need context, so do machines. So LLM can perform better, but it needs context. And now I'm switching to Michal, who will tell us if bots can utilize this information and translate UX.
Okay, thank you, Boryana. That was fascinating. So like we said at the beginning, the machine translation industry really focuses on other sectors when they talk about the ability to do machine translation and the quality of the output. And it makes sense that they do, right? Because machine translation is designed to create good to basically optimize the results for long form content that is made up of sentences and paragraphs and even longer texts. And they were both trained for long form content. So we gave them long form content to learn how to translate. And then they are also tested on long form content. So when companies go and they test machine translation content, they use long form content and long form sentences to be able to tell us how good it's going to perform. And the entire industry is basically optimized for that. So it really makes sense for machine translation companies to focus on those efforts, to focus on those content domains and on those industries as they work on creating their machine translation products, because ideally they're going to be able to provide better results. It's going to look better. The metrics that they're going to present on their websites are going to be better. So we understand why they do that, because long form content basically looks better for machine translation companies. So for example, if you look at this state of machine translation report from Intento, which is a big company, big machine translation company, it covers 9 content domains that are basically, I think, meant to cover the bulk of the industry. And as you can see, UX is not here. They have general and entertainment and hospitality and all kinds of other content domains. They are not focusing on UX at all and not testing for UX content at all. And also, if you see the highlighted sentence there, they removed from the test corpus every segment that was less than 4 words. And that means that basically a lot of potentially UX content that is shorter than 4 words was not even included in the test corpus. So even if they really wanted to include UX, they couldn't, because they're basically removing all UX content or a big part of UX content from their kind of testing method. And if you look at this phrase MT report, then again, we don't know how long the segments were, but we do know that they're not focusing on UX content at all. They are focusing on user documentation and support and all kinds of different, basically complementary sectors for the UX industry, right? Because you do need support and you do need user documentation and you do need marketing. There are all kinds of content that we can do machine translation for today using these kind of domain spotlights and get better results, and we can count on those metrics. But when we talk about user experience copy that is going to fit into our user interface, then we can't really count on those metrics at all. And that is because UX content is very, very unique, right? Because the UX industry has a huge potential for machine translation companies. It is producing a lot of multilingual content. It is working on a lot of languages, and there are products that are localized into 20 or 50 or more languages because they want to have global outreach, and people are much more likely, we know this, much more likely to use products that are translated to their language. And so it's got a very, very big potential, but it is also very, very unique in terms of its challenges, because it's very short and MT is optimized for long form content. And also because of its length, we rarely translate kind of word for word. We always have to take the sentence and kind of make it, process it, and then create a version in a different language that is basically, it has the same meaning, but it's a different version. It's not a word for word translation, which is something that MTs find it harder to do. And also it heavily depends on context. And that is true for all types of content that we translate or localize or machine translate or localize. But here, context is not in a format that can really be fed into an MT. So if in paragraphs in long form content, we have context that we can just feed into the machine, right? Because we have the sentences before and the sentences after, and we can just feed that to the MT. And if the MT is built in a way that takes that context into account, then it can read that and can understand what it needs to do. But in UX, the context is not the sentences before and the sentences after. It is in the layout, it is in the design, it is in the way the code is built, it is in the way that we think about our goals of the product, the goals of the company. It is in the way that we think about the users and their kind of characteristics and their personas. And so this is a lot of context that a lot of the times machine translation will just not be able to decipher, at least not yet. And so it's much, much harder to feed it the correct information that we need so that it can actually output good results. Also, UX processes and UX design in general has very complex goals that are kind of complicated to explain. So we can't just say we need this to be informative, we need this to be convincing. It's much more complex and nuanced than that. And so we need to feed the MT engine, if we actually want it to be able to understand what we need it to do, we need to feed it longer and more detailed explanations and instructions. And it's not all, right? Writing for UX, it heavily impacts the accessibility of the product. And this is something that we really need to consider when we localize, and we also need it to be inclusive. And so we need to be very careful to stay inclusive, but being inclusive is different in every language. So some languages are gendered, and in some languages, they have other requirements and constraints based on their culture and history. And those are things that MT has a really hard time taking into account. And of course, unlike any other content, it is dependent on code. It's dependent on the way that the product is built, on the things that can be achieved or done in a specific screen. And again, this is something that MT is not built to contain. And those challenges mean that a lot of the truth that we know about MT does not apply to the UX industry or to UX copy at all. And such a unique field really needs a different and a unique approach. Because if we don't use MT well, if we don't use MT in a way that is basically helpful for us, then we end up working for the MT instead of the MT working for us. And so we use so much time and energy and funds to achieve something that would have been easier to achieve otherwise. And a lot of the times it's not even something that you say you want to invest a lot of effort now, but then it's going to be much easier and cheaper after. But a lot of the times, if we don't work in a smart way with MT, with understanding the challenges, then it's not going to get faster and cheaper after. And then we don't actually invest any effort that is going to generate any valuable kind of progress for us. And so to make it work for us in a real way, we need to use MT in a way that is really smart and adapted for UX content. So how do you do that? First, we know context is critical, right? But we can't provide automatic context. So ideally, we would want something that we can manually give instructions to. And currently, the only type of MT that would take those instructions is LLMs. You can't do that for an MT. Maybe you could in the future, and that would be amazing. But for now, if you are using an LLM for translation, then you can feed it some instructions. And you want to think about maybe like the brief that you would give to a writer or translator. So the same types of information that you want your translator or your writer to understand, you do want to give that to the LLM too, so that they will know to take into account, it will know to take it into account as it basically makes choices for your copy. I'm doing choices like this, but it's not really choices, of course. And then ideally, you want to train that engine. And that is true not just for LLMs, and LLMs are problematic for now because they are significantly more expensive to train, significantly more expensive to use. So even if you use NMT, you can still train it using high quality UX content. And off-the-shelf NMT is basically never going to work for UX because models were trained on long-form content, and they were trained on content that is basically not UX copy at all and has different goals. And so using a kind of large subset of high-quality user experience copy to train the engine for you is going to generate significantly better results. So the way you do that is you can maybe use your own CMS content if you have enough content to do that. So you can take basically all content that you've localized before. And if you're happy with it, use that to train the NMT, or you can use your TM, but you usually would have to clean it for a little bit because sometimes there's a lot of legacy content in there that is not useful. So if you can clean the NMT, use the TM. Otherwise, you can prepare content yourself. You can just take a long list of English strings, send it to translation, or send it to MT and post-editing, have good quality copy translated for you, then use that to train the NMT for future uses. Or you can buy data. If you have the ability to buy data that is high quality enough in that language, that is specifically UX copy, then you can use that data to train your NMT. So I want to show you an example. This is a test I did this week. And it's not an LLM, it's an NMT. So what I did is I took 22,000 multilingual strings and I trained a Google NMT engine on those. And I used only UX copy that is used in actual apps in Hebrew and in English. So it was translated English to Hebrew. And immediately I could get a 10-point improvement in Blue score, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it is almost a 30% improvement. So we can see that there is a significant improvement in the quality of the output when you train an MT. Now, Blue is not an ideal way to evaluate results, especially now. There are more advanced ways. So I also ran a Comet 2.0, and I ran a BERT analysis too, to get like a better assessment and an idea of how the quality actually improves. And you can see that there is an improvement. The custom Google NMT that I trained basically performed better in both Comet and BERT. And of course, these kind of scoring models are adapted to long form content as well, just like the models for translation. And so the scoring is not, I don't say it's not conclusive, and it's not like an ideal way to figure out the result of and the quality of the final MT because it is not adapted for UX content, just like the models aren't, the translation models. But it is like a starting point. And then I also did an assessment myself, just as a localizer in English and Hebrew. So I basically reviewed the Hebrew strings against English, against the other Hebrew strings that were translated by Google and MT out of the box and Microsoft out of the box. And I saw that both Microsoft and Google were significantly less than the custom MT in terms of fluency and in terms of accuracy. So I can also have that professional assessment of this, at least that specific kind of test subset, but it's definitely something that we need to keep testing for more languages too. So you want to fine tune, like I said, with UX content, ideally very good UX content. And then you also want to use the right engines. And using the right engines would change for each language, for each sector. So if you go back to the Intento report, you can see that different engines actually got better scores for different languages. So AWS was scored really good for English into Arabic, but then it's not even in the chart for English into French or Japanese, and that's where kind of DeepL shines. So different models would perform better for different languages. And the direction also makes a difference. So for Arabic into English, different engines shine, and then English into Arabic, you can see that there are other engines that maybe you would want to use. So that kind of changes, and you want to keep testing based on the actual languages that you need. And Intento, they had a look at NMTs mostly, but they not really test LLMs. They did test them a little bit, but not heavily. So for our needs for UX, I would also recommend to test an LLM and see how significantly better the results are. They may be and they may not be. And this industry kind of keeps changing all the time. The technology keeps improving all the time. So we can keep kind of doing small tests to see if there's any improvement that we can actually use. And it may also mean that maybe you want to use more than one engine to sort of optimize. So if you have 20 languages, maybe for some of these, you would want to use Google. And for some of these, you would want to use maybe AWS to get best results for each of these languages. So you want to plan a test that is kind of going to help you figure out the best engine for you. And you want to make sure that the test actually works for UX. So you want to plan quality metrics that you actually want to test and actually work to tell you about the quality of the user experience that you're going to get from these strings. So I do have a framework that is proposed on the localization station site, which basically isolates the components that actually impact UX rather than just like generic metrics for grammar, punctuation, and stuff like that. And grading for each of these can help you get like a starting point or a beginner and preliminary grasp of whether it's actually going to be good for UX and it's going to improve the user experience, or it's going to create a good user experience. And another metric that you can use is time to edit. So you want to check for actual efforts that are going to be required to take the empty output that you got and actually turn it into something that can be usable in your UI. And ideally, if you use a combination of those two, then that will give you the best idea. So you can use both time to edit and both a quality framework that you create or that you kind of process into something that is going to be useful for you, and combine those to get the best idea of how good the MT and how usable it's going to be. And then finally, you do want to try and give LQA kind of the center stage, because nowadays we still use CAT tools for MTPE, and we look at the content kind of side by side, but the thing that really impacts the experience at the end is how it performs within the context. And so having a localizer look at the copy inside the interface, either in a mockup or in a live kind of environment, that is going to be the most valuable thing in making the MT copy actually usable for your user experience and for actually helpful for your users. So you don't want to skip LQA, and instead you do want to give it the center stage because it's much more important than any of the steps that come before it. And that's it. I'm going to hand over this to Boryana so she can tell you about MTPE and how to do it. So Boryana, take it away.
Thank you, Michal. You used very large amount of data to actually test what we read in other reports, but these examples and up to 30% quality improvement are very significant, because what's the promise of the MT and machine translation post-editing? What's the goal? The goal is to achieve a lot more, translate a lot more, because everybody's producing a lot more texts, but spend less, or at least the same amount that we used to spend for, let's say, half of the amount of the same content. Of course, the main goal from the buyer's perspective is to reduce turnaround time and costs, get it out there as fast as possible, because nobody wants to wait a week for their feature to be available in their language. We all, as users, also want our things now. So the business is pressed in this aspect. MT is also holds a promise to increase consistency. most of us, or the linguist part of us, have edited human translations, and we know that sometimes there's lack of predictability of the type and amount of errors, while with machine translation, the amount and types of errors are very much predictable. Quantifiable quality. Many companies are struggling to quantify the quality of human output. So one of the goals of MT is actually to reduce human impact and human dependency and put everything in quantifiable frames. The MT promise is also that it works everywhere. Well, it doesn't, not with the same result, not with the same quality, and not with the same result. So what Michal told earlier, if you want MT to work, you actually have to give it a large amount of instructions. I like theory, so let's go to the theory and the types of post-editing. Nowadays, my friend Angelo says that the MTPE should stand for Machine Translation Prompt Engineering rather than post-editing, and there's a lot of truth to it. So what's the basic idea and what are the types of MTPE? Light PE was intended to achieve maximum understandability with the minimum amount of effort and corrections. So basically the goal was to get the text to an understandable level, which is accurate, not fluent. And initially the intent was to be used for cost-efficient internal materials. Say you have a global team, offices around the world, and there's a lot of internal communication that has to be conveyed. It doesn't hurt, like it's not a medicine or something. So, you know, understandability is enough. Full PE would stand for comprehensive and full-scale review, which would be equivalent, but not really, human quality, ensures fluency, idiomatic, and overall correctness, and is intended to be used for customer-published, customer-facing texts. However, we should be very clear here. Machine translation is about accuracy. Michal mentioned it earlier. Machines try to translate every word and convey the basics. Fluency comes with human input, with training, etc. Machines translate as machines. They translate words, not meaning, not sense, not intent, not emotion. So yes, we should be clear on the accuracy versus fluency and where MT actually stands, and buyers should know what they are getting. The reality is heavy MTPE. The industry has never been consolidated on how to use machine translation. In the beginning, there were a lot of wrong attempts. I hope we do it better with the LLMs. There are still a lot of examples of generic MT used everywhere for all sorts of texts, for all sorts of languages. Someone buys one subscription to any of the popular engines and just uses them everywhere, which is not the right way to do it because it requires what I call heavy machine translation, post-editing. And what I mean by heavy is we want it at the price of light post-editing, but the amount of effort required is for full post-editing. So there's a clash and lack of conformity between the stakeholders, whether this is the customer or an agency assigning the translation or the linguist who is faced with a text that is unusable, not understandable, but needs to be adapted for specific audience. There's lack of synchronized training. The reality is that almost no one really assigns light or full PE. It's always MTPE. And who understood what is his, problem? So this lack of synchronized training, what agencies, customers, buyers, or linguists understand, it's not really in sync. And of course, this led to reluctance of team members to use MT. And I don't mean only linguists, I also mean UX stakeholders, design stakeholders, because they get something that is raw, that is not working, and then someone has to bear the responsibility. But when the result is of quality, no one wants to bear the responsibility. The results, of course, are not always meeting the expectations because this false promise of achieve more, we do less with less by not doing anything extra is not true. We need to train, we need to customize, And let's talk about how to actually do it. Content has to be optimized. Machines work, but they need to be fed the proper instructions. So put an end to the garbage input, garbage in, garbage out. And how we can do that? We need a need source. Not everybody knows, but often the English source files, linguists do know actually, there are typos, there are wrong structures, there are placeholders which should not be there or are not explained enough. There is no consistency in the source itself. So when we expect consistency in the translation, but not provided in the source, well, the result is the expected one. The same applies for machines. Machines are consistent, and if you want them to deliver the consistent quality, you have to feed them the consistent information. We also need that data. As Michal said very clearly, if you want machine translation to give you up to 30 points or more of improvement, you actually need to feed it data, and you need clean data, not just any data, not my data on medical translations. You need this relevant UX data. You need glossaries. You need to train your engines. And this is not a process that ends with a one training. You also need humans, because the process is very technical. Localization for online and cloud products happens very much in the development stage, internationalization, etc., how to format placeholders and everything. Of course, we need trained content writers and content creators, whether it's design or UX or plain text. And on top, we need multilingual experts to convey all that to the respective markets and make it relevant. And here's a very nice example that I like. It's an accessibility screen, and the text reads, if there's none, click something that is in a different language and is not present on the screen. So from one screen, we can see mistranslation, wrong formatting, missing translation, platform irrelevant because this is on mobile. This was on mobile. So instead of click, we should have tap or touch or select or any other choice. And it's also misleading because as an accessibility screen, it has to be read out. But this is so much misleading to the user that it's practically useless. What the biggest problem here is that how did this, if there's none occurred? The second none is within a placeholder. So this was not synchronized. Then we have the button, which is skip. If you can see the lower corner, it says skip, but on top it says propuskane, which is the Bulgarian word. So basically the user is left with an impossible choice. If there's none, click something that you cannot find, hear, or see. If you speak some English, you will be able to manage it, but still. If you don't, you're in trouble. So Michal and I had a discussion about it, and we stopped on the 4 C's. You know, everybody's talking about the C-suite. Let's talk about the C-suite of content. Very important words for MT to work is controlled authoring. You need the source to be adapted for machine translation. It has to be controlled, it has to be templated, it has to be consistent. Therefore, consistency. We need coherent structures. Where are the placeholders? How do they relate between each other and other parts of the text? And of course, now we all talk about the buzzword of context. And here's a hint. Even without context, a human can produce translation, and so can machines, but they will usually go to the first meaning and not rely on their additional knowledge. You need to feed them this knowledge. First step to success, define scope and goals. If you're going to be translating UX, you need to separate it from, let's say, a help center or desktop translations or any other texts that are not of the same domain. And this goes for all domains. You need to prepare and fix your input data, select the engines, train and maintain training. The initial training occurs once, but it has to be properly done by a trained expert, and then it needs to be maintained. It's a process that requires continuous support, both for the humans and the machines. If you don't retrain your machine translation engine, MT engine, this also is valid for LLMs, you will face yourself with made up words, repeated words, the so-called hallucinations. And of course, everybody needs to be onboarded and trained properly. If the developer doesn't know how to train, if you select a developer who doesn't know how to train, or a UX writer who doesn't know how to use and implement, or a linguist who isn't familiar with the domain and the settings, well, then you will not get the best results. And this is something that I created earlier today. You know, how does a human translate? You know, we give us text, there's no infrastructure really needed. It's a one-step process. And the result is what in the language industry is referred to as the gold standard. Of course, you need an expert trained on your domain, etc., not just any linguist. Let's say this is the 9-shot result. And how do machines translate? There is a very complex infrastructure. I'm sorry. There is a very complex infrastructure. There are multiple stages of LQA. This is a continuous the process that requires continuous support. We need APIs connected, orchestration, and the result is not gold standard. Even the best MT can still not reach the human quality at 100%. Maybe in the future it will be possible for some domains and with the proper training, but for now it's still not there, and everybody needs to be clear about it. And also to be very aware of the fact that to get the best results, you also have to advance invest in the proper humans and processes and infrastructure. How to actually optimize the workflow? Well, reduce steps. 17 steps and 5 stages of LQA do not improve the result. An ideal process would consist of machine translation and then human-performed linguistic QA. Of course, I highly recommend less dependencies. The less tools, the less steps, the less people involved, the better, because the result gets flooded in all of these steps. Turn off the translation memory matching. When we're dealing with UX, it is the best recommendation I can give. And if you recall the example from earlier, save. Save can be translated in a few different ways in a number of languages. So 100% matches and fuzzy matches may actually become your worst enemy and create errors that you don't need. A favorite example of mine is checking. When we're referring to bank account type, and checking, which is the verification, you know, the carousel, it's not okay, it doesn't fit, it's not there. So try and avoid 100% matching, especially for UX. Invest in term bases and glossaries. Oddly enough, machine translation memories are best used as training data, while glossaries and term bases are smaller sets of language which help you and the machines achieve higher level of consistency, and they're very important. So invest in them. They're smaller sets of data, so they're somewhat easier to support and to extract. LLMs can be used for that as well. And then we go to instructioning. As Michal suggested, maybe the UX creation is shifting to text with instructions, which create the shots or the context, instead of doing it post the process where you actually have to decode the message back. It might as well come with the instructions in front. And when you choose a machine translation engine, you have to do it to train it adequately and for the relevant domain. About LQA, how to do it right. There's no uniform answer here. I say better do it with a human, because there are more than one layers and more layers than a machine can perform. It really depends if your text is customer facing, if it's a text that hurts, or if it's a text that is of lower importance and priority. But the thing I can say for sure, do it with context. Whether with human or a machine, you need the context. Words do not exist on their own. They're there for some reason, and LQA steps should always be performed with context in mind and usability. And I'm happy to see that we made it with a little bit above 10 minutes. Michal, back to you if you want to continue.
Yeah, so thank you, Boryana. I've actually learned a lot. And okay, so now we have about 10 minutes for questions. If anyone has questions that they want to ask, you can either just turn on your mic and ask, or you can write it in the chat if you prefer not to, and then I'm going to read it so that we can answer. Also, if you have a question specifically for myself or for Boryana, so just mention who the question is for so that we can actually know who you want answering. Or you can just ask both of us, which is also okay. So anyone has a question?
Doesn't necessarily need to be a question. It could be also a comment or a note or share your experience. Elia shared earlier that he has worked with machine translation about 10 years. For about 10 years now. Elia, can you hear me? Oh, he's gone.
Okay, so even if there are no questions now, which is absolutely fine, then both Boryana and myself are available on LinkedIn. So feel free to connect with us if you're not connected yet, and send us any questions that you have later, or just any thoughts that you've had during or after. Feel free to discuss this with anyone else. And there's also going to be a recording that you can watch if you want to kind of rewatch this and kind of remind yourself, or just share it around if you prefer, if you want other people to be able to kind of learn more about this. And that's it. We're
There's a
around in
question
case
in the chat.
anyone has a question.
Huh?
Yeah, I know I see a question in the chat. How can we Indians work with this? You mean like in Indian languages? How you can use that for other languages? If that's what you mean, then essentially, as long as you have an NMT engine that is supporting those languages that you want to work with, and I know there are a lot of Indian languages, so it depends on kind of what language you want to localize into. But if you have an NMT engine that supports this, and you can also get a kind of data corpus and just train that, just make sure that it's data that actually from UX content, and that is actually localized in a way that is good, that is fluent. And then you can train the NMT engine just like I did for Hebrew. Basically, anyone can do it. It's very easy, and it was even free because when you join Google NMT, you get a little bit of credits that you can try, you can kind of play with. So I'm really encouraging anybody to kind of play around with this and experiment, because I think you can learn a lot just in the process of kind of trying to see how this works. And if you do it in a language that you can also speak or translate into, then you can see how good the results are, and you can actually see for yourself. And if you do experiment and share, then I would actually love to hear about the results and how what you thought about them too in your languages, because I only have, for now, I only have information about Hebrew.
In summary, research which machine translation engines support your language or languages. Check with Intento or Nimdzi or any popular or Taos, any popular consultancy or MT specialist, custom MT as well, who can provide data and information, or use an expert like Michal who can help you with UX specifically. Thank you too.
Hi, hello. Can you hear
Hi.
me?
Yeah.
Hello. First of all, thank you, Boryana and Michal, for this very interesting presentation. I learned a lot. And now I have a question about the practicality of UX localization, especially the CAT tools and how that integrates with machine learning. So how do you train the models, and how do you integrate that with working in a CAT tool?
So Boryana, do you want to take this one first? Because I know you work with Phrase a lot.
Yes, and other tools. Basically, connecting your machine translation to a CAT tool is nothing more difficult than connecting to APIs if you need a custom setup, or you could just use a key. However, some of the CAT tools already offer machine learning and AI-powered selection of machine translation engines. So you can also go to your CAT tool and use the features they provide for selecting domain. You can use on spot your own training data, like you don't have to export and go to Microsoft or Google and train separately your instances and models. So you either need it in an external environment, trained specifically on UX and connected to the projects that refer to UX, or you can use on-spot solutions, which, however, may not give you the best result you're looking for because most of them are based on generic engines. So you need to train it with your data in all cases if you want to achieve the best results.
Yeah, I would also want to add that depending on the CAT tool that your company is already working with, then you probably have a support, either a support center or someone that you could reach out to and ask on how to do this. And that would be the best way to kind of understand, because all of these tools and technologies and also the MT providers, they want you to use their technology. They want you to train your engine. They want you to be happy and kind of keep using it. And so they always have support people who are basically, their goal is to help you get this done. So whenever you want to achieve any kind of task with MT, just kind of try and outline whatever you need, outline your needs, and just reach out to support and ask them how I can get this done. And they would usually be able to help you do it, or at least give you like a little bit of guidance to get started.
It's not as difficult. You know, many people are scared on how to do it, but now there are guides published on how to do it. There are best practices. One can also use ChatGPT to create a step-by-step guides on how to train it. However, depending on the tool that you're using, you have to look into the features that it offers, whether it's machine translation, just automated selection of best machine translation engine per language, per pair and per language, or per domain, how you can use your own data, etc., etc. It really depends on the tools that you have available. Still, the rule applies. It has to be domain-oriented, scope-oriented, and properly formatted and supported.
Okay, thanks. And another question, do you have maybe any statistics referring to the Polish language specifically? Because I haven't seen Polish included.
I think the intent report did have Polish, but maybe I'm mistaken.
No, they didn't. I have actually checked the report, and there was no mention of Polish, which seems odd to me because it's one of the main localization languages currently, especially in gaming, for example, which I deal a lot with. So that was surprising.
Yeah.
Actually, the whole bunch of Slavic languages was somewhat ignored, and you're right, it has been growing popularity, so it's missing. The question lies in your own tests. The answer lies in your own tests, because for Slavic languages, we have a lot more complex structures than the Roman languages. We have to be super clear about it and know before using MT engines generally perform slightly worse in non-Germanic and Romance languages, because Slavic languages, especially, some have different alphabets, some have cases, which is the case of Polish, with genders, inclinations, etc. The structure is a lot more complex, and the truth is that if these languages are used in reports like the popular ones, the results will be lower, so respectively less popular. Advertising of machine translation. Polish helps growing to a big language, so you need to do it. You need to review the websites or the information available on the machine translation engines providers.
I do want to add that basically this is like I'm calling everybody here or listening to this who are interested in maybe creating some sort of test for their language. Just if you want to reach out to me later and I can guide you on how I did my own test. Like I said, I use the free Google credits that you get when you sign up. So it is something that you could definitely do. And I would love to kind of guide you how to do it. And then maybe we can put together all the scores and maybe publish this as like a research paper or something so that we can have more data on how we can actually use and train neural machine translation for different languages for UX specifically, because there's no data for UX now. So if you're interested, then definitely reach out to me later on LinkedIn or Slack or whatever you want, and we can try and get this done, try and make this happen.
There's a question from Simran, how it can be helpful to German language learners. Well, machine translation is for translating, and it requires a specific level of language knowledge. So for language learning, there are other tools and apps for sure. Thanks, Mette, for the comment. I hope everyone managed to find something new or any value in the presentation. I really am getting all the more hooked to UX by Michal, and I want to thank her for that and also thank her for having me. And if anyone has any question or note, now's the time. Michal, back to you.
I think so. I think if there are no more questions, then we're going to wrap this up. I want to say thank you to Boryana again for being here and for taking the time to teach us about machine translation. Because, like I said, she has really extensive knowledge that I would have never gotten to learn otherwise. And I want to thank all of you for being here and for being interested in localization and UX and in the combination between the two, as always. Have a good day, or I think it's probably day for all of you. And that's it. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.